Salon Culture, Culture Action Europe podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Culture Action Europe Elections podcast series. With the European Parliament elections coming up between the 23rd and 26th of May, Culture Action Europe is discussing key cultural topics with special guests, such as freedom of artistic expression, mobility for cultural workers, and the place for culture in the digital age. My name is Sophie Dowden. I am Policy Officer at Culture Action Europe, and in this episode I will be talking to Paul Dujardin, Director General of Beaux-Arts. Paul, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So, to begin, historically there has been a narrative in Europe about common European values and European unity, and it's been somewhat taken for granted, and now we're seeing more challenges with Euroscepticism and anti-European sentiment. So, how can culture encourage a positive understanding of Europe?
I would say globally, culture is our, I would say, common reality, and we are in the art world, and I think artists can certainly help by their work, in the first place, not to show the cultural realities, but to show the specificities. We must be clear that artists will not be these who have to make the change. That it's another world, and we have to be careful that artists don't become an element of instrumentalization in Europe. What I feel that today, with all the challenges we have, I would not speak about problems, otherwise we come always in a negative reality. The challenging of Europe today, that artists can, by their space, but to bring people together, and the element of meeting in this, as you said, digital world, is, I think, the people to people and having these places. But it can be also science and art, and it can be as well a campus, as a museum, as a theater. But I think the human side of Europe is also necessary in all other public spaces and common. It can be also an hospital. I think, and in all these spaces, we have to show again the human side of Europe, beside the all incredible innovation of technology and the new to find a new balance between all that. And I think that artists, in the way of creativity, beside innovation, to find the right balance in European development.
Yeah, absolutely. And another challenge that we see is backlashes against cultural diversity. What do you think we need to do to support cultural diversity on and offline?
But I think that cultural diversity, I must say globally, from my experience, we are still too limited. It's certainly in the large cultural institutions as Beaux-Arts, there is a change, but the change is not fundamental enough. Why? Because there is already an unbalanced situation between the gentrification of cities and the land, and we see it in the main and the major European cities. And there, Brussels, I must say, is still a little bit atypical. We see Brussels, besides being European capital, I'm speaking now about a mid-sized city in Europe with 1 million inhabitants, but with a great large form of diversity, and old institutions, mainly created beginning of the 20th century, need to adapt themselves to this new form of diversity. I think that mainly we see it, as we could say, the center is in the periphery. We see by many other initiatives, workplaces of artists, new, smaller art places where you can create more flexibility and more diversity. And I think that artist workshops, keeping they open, can create a lot of more initiatives that can be accepted. But I think it's a first place that we also say democracy is a form of bureaucracy, but you need it, and I think that you need also their rules. We have also to help to push a certain form of diversity by our legislation in all forms. It's about even aging. It's not only about colors and migration and gender issues. The complexity of diversity is much more complex in a Western world where we are living in. So legal frame have to be improved to push also citizens to do more on that level. And I think that the coming 2020-2030 taking more responsibility also in our institutions to show showcases and to show how we can bring this diversity more in a reality of our institutions.
Yeah. And in line with these challenges we've been talking about, a question that is increasingly raised is that of freedom of artistic expression. Do you see an increasing need to defend freedom of artistic expression in Europe?
Absolutely. It's a complex situation because it's so diverse if you are looking to the European space. First, the European space, maybe it's interesting to refer to that because the European space is not the European Union. And I think that the world of art is keeping, hopefully, still these borders open. So I think that and we do forget that, but it's not only the Brexit, but it's more than that. It's the Nordic countries, the Central European countries, the Balkan. Some are members, some are not members of the European Union, and then we go to the East. And certainly, in a memory, some countries like Russia, because Russia we will remember next year the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and Russia is really a part of this very important narrative related to the 20th century realities: First World War, Second World War, and end of the wall 30 years ago in '89, and communism and so on. And so on the level of populism, I thought that the last decade, since '89, the wall went down, there was a much more will and increasing of democracy. And maybe related to the global world where we are living in, the economic and geopolitical realities, and many people feeling be unfair treated and fear about what will come makes a new way of political parties to play on the game of these topics of anxious and fear, and to play the role of populism. I think that that again, art and science, and we saw it with Soros in Budapest closing a university by Orban, because the common places as art centers and universities and education centers are places where we need to have these open discussions, where we can again bottom up discuss, because we see that in my opinion political parties need to do again a very hard field work if we want to work again on democratic values. It's hard work working on these topics of how we want to live together in a democratic society and be against populism, and the very easy way of bringing people in bad, I would say, bad directions and so on. So I think that's important that art centers by also again the creativity of artists, the way I would say film, cinema can be an important part of these narratives. All the topics who are debated in the contemporary European cinema are fundamental on that. In a way, we can bring these topics on the table and fighting against populism.
Fantastic. And another problem or challenge for cultural workers today is in the area of adequate labour conditions, which is exacerbated by platform work, which is also increasing in society more broadly. In what ways do labour conditions for artists and cultural workers need to be improved, do you think?
Yes, I would give an interesting example from 10 years ago when it was the financial crisis in the United States. We had in a few months hundreds of thousands of people who were leaving the art world because the fundamental changes was that the economic crisis was firing a lot of people from these institutions. We see 10 years later that there are more people working today than 10 years ago in the art sector in the States. It's interesting to see that in some open economies like the United States, many people are working, but still they are poor in the way the fair remunerations are not on the level of what we wish. Even we are looking always to these realities in the transatlantic Anglo-Saxon tradition. And for Europe, I remember when I started 30 years ago, when Thatcher came on power and did these all very liberal reforms, it was a very an interesting period also for cultural institutions. Coming back to the continental Europe, certainly for Belgium, where I could see it's already very different if you look to the north and the south of Belgium, Flanders of Wallonia. So it's again there the benchmark globally of having a well-balanced situation, and the work conditions are so different. Even in the Baltic states, the remunerations and the cost of living is really under the average income of normal realities. And even between France and Germany, the situation is fundamentally different. We know that the GDP for France is double so important as Germany, and the private foundations are much more fundamental to make the work conditions good for, and private initiatives are much more the basic references for cultural initiatives. So the precarization of artists is in many European countries a very dangerous reality. We are not enough conscious, because I'm director of a platform, and mostly you don't see what is behind. Behind it's all these numbers of artists, and education made that a lot of artists, of young people, by their education could go to the art world, but at the same time giving them an economic reality in the work processes, and the labor realities are fundamentally different. So it's really still a challenge. I think it was not still not the work conditions were still not well for many artists in the past, and then there also the gender issues are still also very important and very different between men and women in the art world. So also there, it's not only one problem, it's a much global problem. And then beside these, the platforms who do the productions, and these who bring the creativity, the artists themselves, because we don't see it as we think that education, school systems with art teaching is relatively okay. The organizations as Beaux-Arts, culture centers, they are globally well working because they are depending from local entities, cities and so on, museums. But then we come to the real core of the art world is the creative world with the artists, and there's work to do. And we see always the top, these who are successful. And I'm there that these who are successful, we need more solidarity between the upper level successful artists and the others in a global system of, I would say, the fairness to be educated as an artist, then to have the fairness of having a fair remuneration and the copyright, and even, in my opinion, is to have the opportunity to be an artist, because that is also more and more under pressure also in Europe. It's not only an element of the status, but also to be an artist is even a new problem inside the European Union.
And then another aspect of artists' careers is, in its nature, it's quite a mobile career. And we were talking before also about cultural diversity, which is about bringing people and ideas from different places together. So how important is it to promote mobility for artists and cultural workers?
I think mobility is a reality we had always in Europe. I would say it's, if we go backwards, the Renaissance was a reality to travel through Europe, and it was always there. I think I was already saying that it went over the borders, and I think that Europe understood globally with the Erasmus program, and also related to the subsidiarity of the European policies. We were creative enough to pass by the national policy makers, and sadly enough, through the Maastricht and Lisbon norms, we were hopefully lucky that we could pass by the national policies and giving opportunities to the whole creative world to go over the borders and to work together. What is a global reality? And I think that European narratives are really fantastic by the way artists can work. I'm giving sometimes this example of Le Pont de Millau in France as an European narrative in the way it was made, because it's not only a work of engineers, it's a work of artists and engineers. It's a project in France, it's a British architect like Foster, and it's Belgian engineers who were part of the process. So how you can create innovation and creativity in a common place as Europe, where different artists and engineering and R&D are coming together. I hope that in the future we can keep these borders open, and what Erasmus fundamental philosophy is that you are not related to one or another community or ideology of religious community, that you can still work together and make common training as create projects, and that even not only in independent platforms as arts institutions, but also in the market and professional industries, because you need art is also a market, and is a fundamental market of the European Union. We know how we are looking to that market, up to 3-4% of the GDP. So this open market of innovation and creativity is fundamental, and I hope that we can keep that so.
Absolutely. And with these new challenges of digitalization and globalization, these human soft skills, which can be developed through cultural and artistic education, are really what's beginning to become very important for differentiating humans from what machines are able to achieve. And in this context, do you see a need for greater links between education and culture in response to these global changes?
I think that that's where I think the more Anglo-Saxon already understood it better by creating open spaces for creativity on campuses and universities. I think that that's also an interesting difference between North and the South of Europe and the way we are organizing ourselves. I think that the link between the education and art scene needs to be more linked, because otherwise it's becoming very conservative if you don't innovate in a certain way. And heritage is in that way a form of certainly memory, but also creativity. You need to create, and in an urban world in which we are. And I think that Beaux-Arts showed the importance of this way of interdisciplinarity, intersectorial thinking, related to, I would say, the different approaches, how we can give and solve, or of giving some ideas about complexities of our society. I would say about healthcare, about well-being, about mobility. Maybe 10, 20 years ago, you would not see that curators would be interested by these topics in museums of art spaces. But I think that today there is an openness that a campus can become an art center, as an art center can become a place of education, and that the major topics we are dealing with, and so the examples of our exhibitions and our concepts related to heritage, but bringing in new ideas of how we can look to these today, and where we are looking for a new form of renaissance, if I would say, because we are coming to a certain end, and we know that we have to change, but we don't know how to change. And this change is fundamental, related to the way of thinking also in teaching, the interactivity, the co-creation, the collaboration, and not the passive way. Sometimes education is still a very passive project. You need to learn and to work together in this collaboration. And this way of new formats were existing, but we do forget the way it's done. And I think that that science is on such a high level, but we have to create a new way of trust between the citizens and the science. And I think that art centers can be the best links between a new way of trust, of vulgarization of knowledge in the way. And that can be also in the science world as in the art world. We have there a very important responsibility of platforms in the form of education. And it we relate to values and in the European elections. I think that the project Next Generation Please, we started at Beaux-Arts for a few years, is a way in the complexity of debates. If you cannot explain anymore what you need to discuss in open spaces of parliaments, I think youth have to see that still you can have different ideas and living together. And in this methodology of creativity, making things together in images, in a world of the digital world, and to create new images, not only art schools, in all types of schools. Today, that was this project we started to work on in the recent years, between artists, scientists, and politicians, and bringing these people together and do a bottom-up work, we saw also by research that it was the right methodology, and their arts institutions, I would say, not in the social cultural sector only. We have to build also bridges between the high culture and, I would say, the smaller institutions related to community work. These two have to be more in a balance. And then you can make a better relation also with the academic world, but also with the basic school systems. And we see, before we go to the university, that even in a region as Belgium and Flanders, we see that the technical knowledge is there to go to the university, but a lot of the elements of values you need to learn are absent before you are, as an adolescent, going to a higher education. And we saw it in different studies. So is it to do with the family realities of a new way of living together, that also the school needs to bring in the education system these different ways of living together? And if we don't have this experience of living together in these new urban realities, we will not come to the realities of the common, even in the future. And Europe needs to take conscious about that, also knowing that systems are very different between the north of Europe or the south. Related to the PISA norms, even in Flanders, where we have a high level, and doing studies in a very short time, shorter than, for example, Germany, to have the same level, 1 for 4 students will not have the final terms. And so even that reality, you have to be conscious that 25% of the 1.5 young students in Flanders will not have the final diploma of their studies. So we have to be conscious that we are creating an elite, but at the same time we have to bring a solidarity to have to bring all these young people together to make a better future. And arts institutions need to take their responsibility in this new way of education. And there, I think, Next Generation Please is a fundamental project of Beaux-Arts, and we can share that with many other institutions.
And so now to close, bringing together all of these common challenges that we've been talking about across Europe for artists and cultural workers, do you support calls to double the budget for culture at the EU level?
I would be completely stupid if I would not do that. What is it? I think on that element important is that democracy needs to go on, and to support that Europe is a fundamental project of living together, and that we keep the idea open that culture is a part of the European Union. Even beside the budget, it's not so sure that countries still want to have culture in the European budget. It's not only to protect the doubling the budget, but also to have culture in the budget. So we have to be conscious of that, and we have to give the good arguments, because there are some countries already, and even the largest countries, it was never clear that the larger European countries were fundamentally behind culture on the European level. Because you speak about culture, let's be clear, it was never culture as such. It was much related to culture as mobility, culture as co-creation, culture in the co-productions, culture on the level of translation, and not the production of film. So even on that level, it's so necessary to connect with each other, because it was certainly to solve the crisis in European cinema that we started to see Danish cinema in the south of Europe, and that was by the translations. So these very minimal investments, because it's still a very small budget, even we are speaking about billions, it's still a very small budget. And I would say that's the first thing. So we need to defend still culture in the European budget, and then we have to try maybe by the arts world that culture is everywhere. I said it in the beginning of my interview, culture is everywhere, art is a specific reality, so I think that we need a budget for creating art, and culture can be everywhere, and there it's our creativity that the other departments, the other budgets of the European Union also take responsibility in the common the common issues, what I said earlier, on mobility, on gender issues, on environmental issues, on security. If we live in a digital time and we want to have smart cities and related to these security issues, and the new agency in Tallinn, LISA, who engaged 250 specialists related to the digital world. My hope is that we keep open Europe, because the Americans want to build, or some Americans want to build a wall. We have to be careful that we are not making a digital wall around Europe that we don't see. I hope that artificial intelligence, you refer to robots in your questions. If we want to make this world open, I think we need also to have reflection on the ethical level of the cultural side of all these other departments of the European Union, and that's also a fundamental element to make an inclusive digital world, and there I think the cultural world can be helpful also. So I think that I'm doing a plaidoyer. It's not only to defend the basic cultural budget, but to see how we, the cultural world, can be the right person to speak to all the other commissioners about their responsibilities. And there we are more in questions of ethics, the questions how to look to these fundamental issues related to the experience artists can bring in. And there I'm referring again to all your other questions in the global holistic way. We are looking to the European budget as a whole and how it can be a part of all the other budgets, knowing that the regions as such are already financing 50% of the European budget in the way we are looking to the consolidated budget of the European Union. So I'm in favor of that, and I hope that the countries in Europe, like Germany, who still are defending that, in a way, try to convince with the right arguments all the other countries, because we need to be in a Europe tomorrow where we can find still stakeholders in all the countries defending our common issues, because at a certain point it would be very unbalanced that we have two Europes with two types of countries. These who are still defending what we are discussing here, and the others will not be anymore there. And that's, I would say, the main issues of Europe was this form of solidarity between the countries. And we know that in the most conflict period of the Cold War, the Council of Europe and the multilateral approach was fundamental on human rights, minorities, and so on, to make this Europe a reality. So I hope we have not to come back too much to that period of the second half of the 20th centuries. We have still to fight for many things we solved in meantime, and we are coming back to these problems of today. So the budget is fundamental, but we have to look to that problem as a more holistic global reality.
Paul, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing these fascinating thoughts.
Thank you.
To take part in the CAI Elections campaign and call for the future we want to see for culture and for Europe, just follow the link in the episode notes of this podcast. You can also join in the discussion on CAI's live online dialogue, welcoming MEPs and citizens to discuss a variety of themes, such as those discussed today. This dialogue takes place on the 25th of April at jamart.eu. You can find more information in the episode notes. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to check out other episodes in this series and share it with your friends and colleagues.